A recent statement from you, something is terribly wrong in China. Just explain that. What's going on?
We don't know exactly what's going on. There are rumors that there was a coup. I don't think the rumors are true, but something extraordinary is happening. We know this because last Wednesday, China actually canceled 60% of the flights. At the same time, they canceled high-speed rail and bus arrivals and departures from Beijing. There's this video, which we think is true, but who knows, of an armored column, 80 kilometers long, heading towards Beijing. So there's a lot that's going on. The general consensus is that there's high-level infighting at the top of the Communist Party. This is in the run-up to the 20th National Congress of the party. That starts on October 16th. There, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is looking for a precedent-breaking third term as general secretary of the party. In other words, as China's ruler. And so there's a lot going on right now. But the Chinese system has become less transparent over time, and that means people on the outside, and that's including people in China are on the outside, we can only guess.
This seems ominous. How concerned do Americans need to be at this point?
Americans need to be concerned because whenever the Communist Party leaders struggle with each other, anything can happen. And so stability in the world's most populous state, yeah, that's a real issue for not just Americans, but for everybody else. Especially we have seen a very belligerent Beijing in the last half decade. They've gone after India, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, of course. There have been these extremely dangerous and provocative intercepts in the global commons, in the air and the sea. And so right now, China is a dangerous state. And whenever the leaders fight, yeah, of course, this is going to be a concern for everybody in the world.
On that note, the ongoing conflict with Ukraine and Russia, explain where China stands with that. Currently, these nuclear threats that seem to be going back and forth, and why is it something we should be paying close attention to?
Many people think that China is trying to distance itself from Russia, but I'm not so sure that that's true. What we do know is that when Vladimir Putin went to Beijing on February 4th of this year, immediately afterwards, they issued their 5,300-word joint statement that declared their no-limits partnership. And for instance, about 3 weeks ago, China's third-ranking leader actually spoke to the State Duma in Moscow, and he voiced China's clear and explicit support for the war in Ukraine. Xi Jinping, when he went to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Uzbekistan about a week ago, he reaffirmed that commitment. And we have seen just beyond just words, China with its elevated commodity purchases has been effectively financing the war. China's opened up its financial system to Russian institutions that have been sanctioned. China's put its diplomats in service of the Kremlin. China's put its propaganda units amplifying Russian disinformation about the war. China's been supplying location data, in other words, military information to the Russians. So this is a full support for the Russian war effort. And a lot of people in our country just hope that China would back away from Russia, but really haven't seen any evidence of that.
You've said before that we don't want a Cold War, but the Russians and the Chinese do.
The Russians and the Chinese want to take down the existing international system. They want to take down the United States. They see the world in the same terms. They identify the same adversary, which is us. And so they're working very closely together. And it's not just Russia and China. You've got Iran, North Korea, and others that are on the periphery of this new axis. Now, we Americans don't want to acknowledge that this has occurred, but in fact, it has. And if we're going to protect ourselves, if we're going to defend our way of life, we better acknowledge existing reality.
But even these leaders, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, meeting dozens of times, and that's on record at this point.
The two of them have met now, I think, 39 times in person. So clearly they do like to talk to each other. And of course, they are talking by phone all the time. And really what this means is that they have coalesced because they do believe that they are working for the same goals. And that means we've got to be concerned because we're the target of their ambitions.
Specifically, what should our leaders be doing? President Joe Biden, what would you like to see be happening here?
I think the United States should sever commercial investment, technological relations with China. And I know that for many Americans that sounds extreme, but we know that the Chinese are working to destroy the United States, and we should not be financing that. So for instance, just to take two examples, the Communist Party is behind the fentanyl gangs. You can't operate these large, well-organized criminal organizations without the blessing of the Communist Party in the party's near total surveillance state. And by the way, these fentanyl gangs, they launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. So that's about 77,000 Americans last year that died from fentanyl overdoses, and that number's been going up. We should consider each of those deaths a murder. COVID-19. We don't know where SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen for this disease, came from, but we do know that once this was out in Chinese society, that Xi Jinping deliberately spread it beyond China's borders. He did two things primarily. First of all, he lied about contagiousness. He knew this disease was highly transmissible human to human, but for weeks he told the world it was not. And then while he was locking down his own country, and I know lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down his own country, he was telling the world this is an effective way to stop the disease. So while he was locking down his own country, he was pressuring others, including the United States, not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China. You put those two things together, and the only conclusion is that he deliberately spread this disease to the world. This is the first time in history that one nation has attacked all the others. That's 1,054,000 Americans that have been killed by this disease. That's 6.5 million people outside China who've been killed by this disease. And I know it's harsh, but those are murders. Those are the intentional taking of life without justification. We have more than 1 million Americans who have been murdered. President Biden needs to confront that. He needs to raise it with the Chinese. He needs to talk about it with the American people. We need to stop funding China. One other thing, Liz, and that is that we know, why talk about this? This is 2 years ago, but the point is that China's now working on pathogens they call specific ethnic genetic attacks. In other words, they will leave Chinese people immune, but they will sicken and kill everybody else. That's a civilization killer. And we need to establish a deterrent so that Xi Jinping won't spread that. Right now, we've imposed no costs on China for killing more than 1 million Americans. What's to stop him from spreading these specific ethnic genetic attacks when they develop them?
These actions may seem extreme. Look at the consequences. Many of us are still dealing with them to this day.
Not only the deaths and the infections, but we've changed our society. And many people have been disadvantaged by that. We've got a whole generation of kids who have lost a year, 2 years of learning. We had the disorganization in society. The riots and the disturbances, really right after the lockdowns, I think that is very much a consequence of that. We've had trillions of dollars of lost output in our economy. You just go down the line. This has been a grievous wound in America and in other societies.
But you're right, there seems to be this secrecy surrounding it. Do you ever feel like the truth will be known when it comes to the origins?
I think there are two reasons why we'll know. First of all, we can see SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen itself. We can analyze it. It does look engineered. But the second thing is the Chinese people are going to tell us. And they've started to already. Now, the Communist Party has done its best to prevent the truth from coming out. But the Chinese people are going to tell us even more. And I think eventually we will find out.
Final thoughts, but how serious of a threat is China, and why should we be paying attention to what's happening 7,000 miles away?
China under Xi Jinping has been malicious, but I believe now there is an urgency to our defending ourselves, and that is that Xi Jinping, I believe, sees a closing window of opportunity to achieve China's historic goals. Right now in China, the economy in reality is contracting. There's a debt crisis. Property prices are plunging. Worsening food shortages, a deteriorating environment, and these uncontrollable COVID-19 outbreaks. But on top of that, China is on the edge of the world's steepest decline in demography in the absence of war or disease. Chinese demographers believe that the country will lose about half its population within 45 years. If we look at the end of the century, China could be 1/3 as populous as it is now. No nation has ever faced that before. You know, Xi Jinping, his diplomacy is to intimidate others. And if your country is 1.41 billion people, as China claims, and you're the world's most populous society, yeah, you can intimidate others. But you can't do so if your country's falling apart. And that's why I believe that the China threat is imminent, and we've got to get through the next 2 or 3 years. If we can do that, we probably will be okay. But the problem is that Biden administration and the top levels of the Pentagon, I don't believe that they see urgency. They see a China threat maturing half-decade from now, maybe a decade. I believe that we've got to be concerned in the next several years.
And we've done recent reporting on just the amount of land that is being bought up in the U.S. By the Chinese, and that's received quite a bit of attention.
We don't know what Chinese partners are doing with their land, but we know they're buying it at a very fast clip. There are reports that some of the people are using it to commit espionage against the United States. There's that large plot of land near Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. And of course, there's this Chinese enterprise that bought 300 acres within 12 miles of Grand Forks Air Force Base. That's where we have sensitive satellite uplinks. But there are other things that are happening. So, for instance, Chinese parties are buying farmland, and they got illegal marijuana grows. They're in Oklahoma, they're buying plots, and they're building fences, not to keep people out, but to keep people in. And there's a suggestion that there is human trafficking. They're using land for human trafficking operations, even sex trafficking operations. And we also know that they're poisoning the land. So this is a concern. And until we have a handle on what's going on, we should not be allowing Chinese parties to buy farm or ranch land in the U.S. And I believe that we should be expropriating land already held. If Chinese parties have not been committing crimes, then we should pay compensation. But if they have been committing crimes, we should forfeit them under federal forfeiture statutes. We need to do this because right now the world is facing a food crisis. And in some of these plots of land, Chinese are just buying it and letting it lay fallow. That's not a normal crime, but when you're facing a food shortage and you need all the land in production, then yes, that's a real problem for the United States.
It's in all of our best interest to better understand the subject and to just actually hear more about it.
Until we know what China's doing with our land, we need to be extremely concerned because I don't believe that there's a sense of urgency in the Biden administration. And also, I don't believe that we understand what China intends to do with our land. But we do know one thing, Liz, and that is China uses all points of contact with the United States to undermine our society. And we are being overwhelmed. And until we get a handle on this, we need to sever those links with China. At some point, we may feel that we can deal with the Communist Party, but until we can, we need to cut those links in order to defend our society and our way of life.
Well, certainly concerning, but an important conversation. Thank you, Gordon Chang.
Thank you, Liz.